This is the third video lecture on the chapter of midlife, or yeah, midlife. So we're talking about that period between your mid-20s up to your, no, I'm sorry, we're talking about the period in your 40s to your 60s. And we ended the last lecture kind of abruptly. I was talking about personality development, but I had to have to keep my videos to a certain length, and I didn't want to rush this particular section. I wanted to talk a little bit about it. Okay, so personality. By definition, we're talking about patterns of behavior and feelings and emotions and thoughts that are consistent across time and place. And the thinking is that the theory is that your personality is relatively fixed by your mid-20s, but it's not like permanently fixed. Your personality does change. So what's discussed in your textbook is it's sort of the go-to personality model right now, and it's based on what's called trait theories. Now, there have been a handful of different trait theories proposed. One trait theory had like 36 traits. One of them had 3 traits, but the one that is given is discussed in your textbook is referred to as the ocean, or it's the big 5. It's called the big 5, and you can remember what those 5 are by the acronym OCEAN or canoe. So there's O, which stands for openness to experience, C, which is conscientiousness, E, which is extroversion, and A, which is agreeableness, and then N, which is neuroticism. Um, and each one of those things, so openness to experience is kind of, that makes sense. You know, you like to try new things. E, C, conscientiousness. How conscious, how concerned are you about other people? Are you a rule follower kind of thing? OCE, extroversion, which is obviously extroversion versus introversion. Where do you get your energy? Do you get your energy by being alone or by being in the company of other people? Agreeableness, right? How agreeable, how flexible are you? Are you more into like conflict, or do you want to avoid conflict? And then neuroticism, which is a fancy way of saying things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenic, those kinds of things, right? So the assignment that I'm going to queue up, that I'm going to associate with this chapter, invites you to take it's 160 questions online. It doesn't take but 10 minutes, and it will produce a report that captures each one of these concepts. Under these concepts um, are other components too, like the one that I remember, if I can find it, I'll put my own personality assessment up there too. But the one that always sort of makes me chuckle is what is it? Creativity, right? Or yeah, creativity. And mine is like low. I have low creativity. Let's see, what are some of the others? Then you have like depression. That's under the neuroticism. Excitement seeking, I believe that's under, I think that's under the E, openness to new experiences. And it's kind of fun. But anyway, if you read your handout, it's got some of that stuff. And then the assignment that I've asked you to do has some of those things too. What I always tell students is that's fun about these scales is that you could do them now, and then if you come across it, in 6 months, and do it again and see what's consistent. I do mine about once every year, and a lot of them are the same, but a few of them sort of change from time to time. Okay, so basically what's happening by the time you're midlife, your personality is relatively stable, but there are a few things that continue to change. And that's kind of what it talks about in your textbook. That's the big 5. Okay, so also discussed in this chapter are some of the things that I think I talked about in the second lecture, or maybe it was the first lecture, about marriage. Some marriages are getting better during midlife. Some that were bad before are still bad. So according to the statistics, that overall divorces are declining, right? So overall, but there is an increasing number of people who get to this in midlife. So more people are likely to divorce in their 40s through their 60s today than contemporary. But you probably heard some of the statistics about divorce, that 50%, and those are it's not that those statistics are not true, but we have to be careful how you interpret those statistics. What that basically means is that pretty much at any given time, there are twice as many marriage licenses filed as there are divorce petitions. It does not mean your chances of getting divorced are 50-50, but the fact that more people today are getting divorced after in this midlife stage, that is sort of an interesting part of that. Speaks to that we're living longer, right? We're living longer than before. So it's divorce during midlife. Oh, another really interesting statistic I think worth pointing out, that would be my cat Zelda back there, is that women are filing, 2/3 of marriage petitions are filed by women. So what that kind of implies is that women are getting to their 40s and they're like, yeah, the kids are grown and I don't want to be, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I'm thinking about the women that I know, and that was the timing. That was when their youngest child graduated from high school. So women are filing for more divorces. Women are emotionally recovering faster, but that makes sense because they're more emotionally prepared. Women don't do as well after divorce. Men actually are more likely to get married. So women are divorcing them, and men are more likely to have a second partner or have a second wife sooner than a woman will have another partner. Yeah. So, and then second marriages are actually less likely to stay married than first marriages. What are some of the other things here? Oh, it offers some suggestions, like we should be realistic, don't have your expectations too high. Be sure, what's it say? That focus on the positive. So once we start, this goes back to mood congruence, which we talk actually about in psychology. You start focusing on the negative aspects of your partner, their negative attributes, and you're just going to continue to focus on the negative. So if you focus on the positive, you're more likely to see the positive. Your book suggests compromise. Actually, what they tell us in the marriage and family literature is compromise is not necessarily a good solution, because a compromise is potentially a lose-lose. Imagine, for instance, you want to live in Kansas City and your partner wants to live in Wichita, so you live in Topeka. You're both unhappy, right? That would be a compromise. So the books that I have read suggest that maybe what you should be doing is taking turns. Like, you get it your way this time, and they get it their way the next time. You might call that a compromise, but finding a third path is not necessarily going to make successful. All right, this is also a period of time where we may be experiencing the empty nest, and it is interesting. I kind of almost have an empty nest, and I was prepared for it to be like awful, and quite frankly, it hasn't been awful. And part of that is because the cultural stereotype is, well, we have mixed messages. Is this a time of liberation for the parents, or is this a time of, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do? And what the literature does suggest is that for traditional households, for women who were primarily stay-at-home parents, this can be a hard time, because if their identity and if their routine, if their schedule is all attached to them taking care of children, and now there's no children to take care of, how do they organize their day? How do they organize their time? So that can be difficult. The research also suggests that it's not as bad for dads as it is for moms, but that depends. That depends on what kind of relationship the fathers have. If the father maybe only had a relationship of convenience and only saw his children at dinner time, and now there's no children at the dinner table, this might be the end of their relationship, right? So it depends on what kind of relationship has already been established with their children. In my house, I like to say, you need to text your daughter, you need to speak to your daughter. I mean, I think he would reach out if I wasn't here, but a lot of the female, it's called kin keeping. So a lot of women will do that sort of, nurturing those relationships. Another concept that's discussed in your chapter is helicopter parents. And helicopter parents are, so actually, if you're familiar with the federal law, FERPA, right? FERPA is the law that protects student records. And that, when I started teaching, there was no FERPA law. I believe this came out of these helicopter parents, the parents that were highly involved in their children's lives. And I can remember as a young graduate student instructor, I would get phone calls from parents wanting to know their children's grades in my class. And today, that's illegal. Today, I can't give them that information without permission from the student. I have to say that you need to ask your student if there's not permission. Sandesh Generation is another thing that the research talks about during this stage of life. The Sandwich Generation refers to the parents. I guess it's kind of, I was example of a sandwich generation, but I was in my 30s. That's when your parents, you're parenting your parents and you're parenting your children, and so you're sandwiched in between. I'm sure you've heard me tell the story before, but I remember standing in my kitchen one time and my mother was very upset and she was crying, and she used to stay in the basement, and she was standing at the top of the steps, and she's crying and she storms off to her room. And I turn around and there's my 9-year-old daughter who's standing in the entryway, and she also is crying and she storms off to her room. And I remember thinking, who do I get a cry to? Where do I get a storm? And so this sandwich generation can be quite stressful because you're parenting both ways. What else is discussed here? You have abuse. I don't want to lose sight. Don't want to not talk about domestic violence, especially under quarantine, right? I mean, all the sources that I'm reading are suggesting, and no doubt it's true, is that domestic violence and probably child abuse too, that the rates of these are increasing. Especially when you are in situations that you don't have any control of, and financial situations, risky situations, abusers who are stressed will be more violent. So while no doubt some people are thriving by having to stay at home, for some people this is a very dangerous time. And I was saying to my friend the other day who works at the domestic violence shelter, is like, what can we do? Like, what can I do? I have no money, I have no power, I don't, but know that I'm thinking about these women and I'm praying for their well-being. Um, and then there's a discussion in your chapter too about the cycles of abuse. It's unfortunate that we don't have more of an opportunity to talk about it. But domestic violence or domestic trauma, I recently heard it referred to as that. It does go through this cycle. So there's this buildup of tension. There's a big explosion where the physical violence may happen. And then what's typical of the abusers is there will be regret and remorse. And, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And so things get better, and it goes back to what's called a honeymoon period. And then there'll be this gradual tension and building up again. And people who have lived in abusive situations learn to recognize that cycle. And there have been some scholars who have written about how that when the tension begins to build, that an abuse survivor may actually provoke it, because the anxiety of wondering when it's going to happen, when the explosion is going to happen, is worse than the actual violence. And so they may provoke it. They may cause it to happen as a way to just get it over with, so we can move back to that next stage of the cycle, right? Move back to that honeymoon period. I will put up attached here is a link to the crisis center. If you know of someone who needs support during this time. And I always like to say that violence is not about love. Violence should not hurt. And love should not hurt unless you have a safe word. That it is about power, and no one needs to live in those situations. There are ways to get out. The typical the typical survivor will attempt to leave 7 times. They will attempt to leave an emotionally or physically abusive situation 7 times before they finally do. So if you know someone and you've tried to help them and they just keep going back, just continue to help them. The time was just not right. And the time in which it's most dangerous for them, where they're more likely to be killed, is actually when they leave. So they're leaving a dangerous situation and will likely find themselves in a more dangerous situation before things are all better. I'm going to stop this lecture here, and I think when we come back, we'll be able to, oh my goodness, we only have one more slide when we come back.